Hello and welcome to The Value of Others, Part 12. We are on the final Henry Winterman's Half Corona cigar. And I have no fucking lighter on me. And a nice big mug of coffee. Homemade. Without any further ado, continuing on from last time, the fifth principle is that the more powerful player is the one more willing to transgress. This is not an endorsement of transgressive acts, it's just a fact in reality. Most people are not only bound by the laws of their society, but they are bound even more rigidly by social convention and their internal programming as well. Those who are willing to transgress across a wider field of play, from self-imposed internal rules to externally enforced social prohibitions, typically gain in power, as they are not limited to the scope of their action to the same degree as rule followers. This generally affords such individuals a greater arsenal of potential strategies they can implement more forcefully, making them both more flexible and more effective. Of course, successful transgression must be competent, ideally sufficiently competent to evade detection. Otherwise, it will be met with a much retributive justice as the forces of accountability can muster. However, competence paired with a willingness to strategically transgress, as say a calculated risk, is often more effective than we would collectively care to admit. One of the many reasons why those who are more willing to transgress are more powerful is that these people are typically better competitors. Imagine trying to win at the highest echelon of any sport without even ever committing a foul. It wouldn't be possible, as you would be handicapping yourself in a way that none of your competitors were. The amount of additional skill needed to overcome that restriction would be insurmountable at the highest levels of play, where margins of success become increasingly narrow. Again, without condoning transgression, it's important to understand that fouling is part of the game. All games forbid certain behaviors in order to refine the scope of play, and they establish clear and explicit penalties for enacting those behaviors. Otherwise, you don't have a game. You have chaos, and given the risks involved, we should expect to find the most masterful play occurring on the border between the allowed and the prohibited, which is precisely what occurs. Those who are willing to risk stepping out of bounds have a larger field to play, both literally and figuratively, relative to those who are not. This willingness makes such individuals more competitive, and their competitiveness makes them more likely to achieve their goals. Understanding this principle goes a long way toward explaining why those with dark triad personality traits, narcissism, Machiavellism, and psychopathy, often succeed, at least in the first two phases in the game of mating and dating. While such individuals are obviously not virtuous, their apparent freedom from the often self-imposed limitations to which most people are subject, and their seeming indifference to the consequences of those who do not possess the emotional strength to violate social norms, such individuals can seem bold, courageous, confident, exciting, and self-proposed. This mixture of traits can imbue a relationship with a great deal of passion. When it's good, it's great. But when it's bad, it can be absolutely horrible. This is because those with dark triad personality traits are not, in fact, emotionally strong. Rather, their behavior merely mimics emotional strength. Though some people might be able to produce remarkably convincing simulations of emotion, these individuals are rigidly defended against their own emotional experience. This, this partial alienation from self allows dark triad individuals to continue past the point where others stop. For better or worse, they are not dissuaded by the emotional pain that others feel for the simple reason that they don't feel it. Strength is feeling the pain but tolerating it. Madness is not feeling the pain at all. Unsurprisingly, relationships with those dark relationships with those with dark triad traits are impossible to maintain. Phase 3. If these people are willing to violate social norms, then it would be lunacy to expect them to respect relationship norms. They also tend to project their own repressed emotions onto their partners, which can be an incredibly frustrating and crazy making experience. Between the transgressive behavior and the lack of accountability, the relationship becomes untenable. However, by this point, many of these players have already gotten what they wanted, so the termination of the relationship is no great loss. After all, if relationships are the media in which value is transacted, then they become increasingly irrelevant once the transaction has occurred. The sixth principle is that the more powerful player is the one more tolerant of emotion. As previously discussed, most of the core strategies utilized in the game of Please No are emotional manipulation techniques, and emotional manipulation can only occur if those being manipulated are complicit in its success. This happens when those being manipulated are sufficiently intolerant of a particular emotion that they assent to the behavioral alternative held out by the manipulator as the means of escaping that emotion. If players were able, if players were better able to show resilience in the face of their own negative or distressing emotions, that is, to experience their feelings without necessarily taking action, then they would be much more difficult to manipulate. The benefit of emotional resilience for givers is obvious. If core strategies are emotional manipulation techniques, and if emotional resilience significantly reduces the effectiveness of emotional manipulation, then givers with a high degree of emotional resilience would be functionally immune to the core strategies in the Wanter's playbook. This would allow them to keep what they have more easily and effortlessly than otherwise. However, this is an essential skill for Wanters as well. If the universe lives closed, then Wanters must be prepared to experience and ideally learn from a vast amount of rejection. There is no way around this fact of life. Unfortunately, most people have a grossly distorted conceptualization of rejection. This is namely, that rejection is painful, personal, and permanent. I call this the 3P fallacy. In fact, rejection is none of these things. It is simply information, feedback from the universe, that you haven't yet unlocked the desired outcome. And if players learn to listen, they can also potentially hear the clue in the rejection regarding how they might be able to move in the direction of getting what they want. This is why emotional resilience is so important for wanters. Experiencing rejection as painful impairs the ability to hear the clue contained therein. For instance, if wanters, under the influence of the fallacy, perceive rejection as, say, a personal insult, then they will inevitably experience some degree of anger as a result. And this anger will make it increasingly more difficult to accurately discern the information contained in the rejection as the emotion intensifies. This is not only because all emotions are distortive to some degree, but also because it's simply hard to listen if the listener isn't quiet. The absence of sound is only the most superficial expression of silence. True quiet comes when the inner state of a person is peaceful and equilibrated. And it is this state, like the face of a serene pond, that is most conducive to a faithful reflection of reality. Wanters with a high degree of emotional resilience are much more likely to achieve their desired outcomes because they will be better able to persist in rejection long enough to attain their goals, and because they will be less likely to distort the information contained in givers' rejections. All other things being equal, this affords emotionally resilient wanters the possibility of securing what they want much more efficiently, and this, in turn, will decrease the total amount of time wasted spent in rejection, creating a virtuous cycle. One final note: the capacity to tolerate pain is patience, which is why we call those who seek help in alleviating their suffering patience. Exercising greater patience than your partner can also lead to victory, either because the other will eventually give you what you want in order to get rid of you, depending on the victory, either because the other will simply give up and leave you alone, or because the other will eventually give you what you want in order to get rid of you, depending on the role. Just keep in mind that employing this strategy often takes far longer than most people anticipate to achieve the desired result. The seventh principle is that the more powerful player is the one who is less visible. This one is a little counterintuitive. Power as a function of visibility is curvilinear. In any given social, both In any given society, both the most powerful and the least powerful members are invisible. For instance, a homeless psychotic could be standing in the middle of the street waving his arms and shouting at the top of his lungs in broad daylight, and people won't even look at him. They see him, but they don't see him. The lowest status people in society are functionally beneath recognition. Some might lament this fact, but is also but invisibility is also not without its advantages, such as freedom of movement and immunity from certain laws. On the other hand, the most powerful members of a society are also invisible. These people are not the kings or the presidents or the CEOs. They're the ones behind the scenes, pulling the strings. But by exerting their influence through the official channels, they retain all of their power without suffering any accountability. What's more, there are far fewer risks associated with acting from the shadows. When things go sideways, it's the king's head on the chopping block, not his advisors. And it's this invisibility that keeps power secure. After all, how can you get rid of something you don't even know exists? Appreciation of this reality complicates the modern narrative of power, especially as it concerns the historical relationship between men and women. The predominant view in the West today is that since men have traditionally occupied nearly all the visible positions of power in society, women must have been oppressed by patriarchal control. And while women have been oppressed by men at times throughout history, it is not true that a male-dominated society is necessarily oppressive. Many powerful men throughout history have been controlled by their wives and lovers, who exerted their influence through private channels with little risk and less accountability, like Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth. These women wielded power through men, which was both safer and more cunning than yielding power directly. And while there may not be statues devoted to these women today, this also means that their effigies won't be burned with the memories of those they represent run afoul on the current historical moment. In any case, the less visible partner is often the more powerful player in the relationship. This is not only because they are exempt from many of the responsibilities and expectations associated with this ability, but also because their relative invisibility increases the effectiveness of certain core strategies, e.g., pity, victimization, and decreases their susceptibility to others, e.g., humiliation. For instance, people have a field day when a tycoon or a politician gets divorced, but they might not even know his former partner's name. Those who have a lot to lose, which is precisely where the visibly powerful are vulnerable. The eighth principle is that the more powerful player is the one who is more flexible. Though he wasn't the first to put the idea into words, Maslow's maxim remains the pithiest. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Basically, this means that the fewer strategies wanters possess, the easier it is for givers to keep them at bay. Their limitations make them consistent and predictable, which functionally automates their rejection. However, it's also important to keep in mind that multiple competencies are useless if players are unwilling to use them. A sword rusts in its scabbard. Flexibility is essential because vanishingly few outcomes are achieved on the first attempt. The more strategies wanters have, the more adaptable they are in their implementation, the more likely they will eventually transform a given no into a yes. The most successful wanters in the game are like water, they flow. They are not committed to any given strategy, and they're responsive to the feedback they receive in their rejection. While they are firmly committed to their ends, they are extremely flexible with respect to their means. Politicians are often very adept at this, which is one reason why people mistrust them. Politicians are comedians. They can blend in. They can read the room and quickly grasp the mood of the moment. Their cultivated intuition about what someone wants to hear, coupled with the ability and willingness to radically change tack, if necessary, together make these individuals exceptionally skilled players. However, this principle isn't only applicable to wanters. Givers also benefit from increasing flexibility. This is because givers aren't perpetually on the defense, simply trying to resist wanters' various attempts at manipulation. In fact, givers can be just as manipulative as wanters because they, too, can imbue their communication with various forms of emotional content. Givers move beyond simply being reactive when they want to wrest control of the interaction to serve their own ends, or when they want to end play with a particular wanter. For instance, givers can reject so seductively that wanters are subject to forgetting what they wanted in the first place. On the other hand, they can also reject so intimidatingly that wanters don't just give up trying, they reject asking to begin with. They regret asking to begin with. So flexibility in approach can be beneficial to givers as well. With respect to the game of mating and dating, this is precisely why players should take anything said during a breakup with often more than a grain of salt. Givers can't really quit the game. All they can do is convince wanters to stop asking. This is why givers' termination strategies generally take one or two forms. In the first form, givers assume all the responsibility for the failure of a relationship, e.g., it's not you, it's me. This might seem kinder, but it functionally attempts to manipulate wanters' hope by indicating that no possible strategy or corrective action wanters might implement has any chance of success. If givers were to concede that wanters were responsible for at least some of the failure of the relationship, then this would create a rational basis for wanters to keep trying. However, if the accepted narrative is that responsibility lies solely with the givers, then there is nothing more to be done. In this scenario, givers end the game by manipulating wanters into believing that further action is hopeless. And in the second form, givers unleash as much vitriol, malice, and spite as they can muster. The idea here is twofold. On the one hand, these givers are trying to induce enough emotional pain in wanters that they are motivated to end the interaction of their own accord to avoid further harm, and on the other hand, they are attempting to destroy any positive regard the wanters might still have for them in order to eliminate the basis for future approaches. This isn't a pleasant strategy, but it can be very effective. If it is successful, wanters experience both diminished motivation to approach and increased motivation to avoid. bringing an indefinite close to the unwanted interaction. In this scenario, givers end the game by manipulating wanters' desire. In both cases, the important thing to understand is that givers aren't really telling the truth when they employ these tactics. Rather, they are saying whatever they believe in the moment will effectively they are saying whatever they believe in the moment will effectively incite the emotional experience that will motivate a wanter to stop asking. And this experience is typically some form of pain, as this is the primary way in which aversion is manipulated in all higher animals. So don't put too much stock in what is said during a breakup. The words were chosen less for their veracity than for their ability to induce a specific emotional state to change your behavior. The ninth principle is that the more powerful player is the one who is more knowledgeable about the other. As the saying goes, knowledge is power. Unfortunately, years of academic indoctrination have led most people to misconstrue the knowledge in question, to refer to factual knowledge, which is functionally useless. Knowing that Vaduz is the capital of Liechtenstein, or that the Battle of Hastings occurred in 1066, or that the Mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell, has never made anyone more powerful. The knowledge this phrase refers to is the knowledge of how things work, and it's the knowledge of how people work that is most directly related to the exercise of power. Books like this can help you understand how people work in general. However, in the game of please, no. This understanding is only useful to a point. This is because it's not possible to play with people in general, only with specific individuals, and these specific individuals have their own desires, preferences, and goals, some of which will deviate significantly from normative or statistical expectations. Consequently, wanters only have two choices if they want to be successful. Either they must appropriately tailor their approach to the specific giver in question, or they must take massive action to increase the likelihood that their specific approach will find a responsive audience among givers in general. The two options are mutually exclusive in practice, as it's not possible to scale a custom-tailored approach, given the costs involved. Wanters' ability to tailor their approach effectively depends on their knowledge of the giver in question. They can glean this knowledge piecemeal by listening attentively to the information contained in a particular giver's rejection. However, the process can be greatly expedited. Expedited. I can't fucking say this word. What the fuck does it say? Expedited by learning as much as possible about the individual giver, either through careful observation, surreptitious research, or, as a last resort, direct questioning. Learning what a person hates and loves, fears and desires, regrets and hopes is an absolute goldmine, as it reveals the specific pathways through which one can effectively implement the general strategies. After all, it is much easier to say, seduce, intimidate, or charm if you know what certain person desires, fears, or hopes, respectively. This is why asking questions is one of the most reliable indicators of interest. The questioner is trying to secure information on how best to go about getting what he or she wants. Without sufficient interest, there is rarely a desire to learn more. Knowledge about the other player serves both a positive and negative function, both of which facilitate obtaining a desired outcome. In its positive function, this knowledge may be construed as knowing what the other person wants. In general, no one cares what you want, and the less acquainted you are, the more indifference they exhibit. This is why going around trying to convince others to give you what you want is a terrible strategy, A much better idea is to determine what other people want and then figure out how to frame the achievement of your goal as a means to the achievement of theirs. If wanters can demonstrate that their goal is a means of their partner's ends, then they stand a much better chance of securing a yes from any given giver. And this, of course, is facilitated by accurate knowledge of the other party's desires, hopes, and aspirations. On the other hand, in its negative function, this knowledge may also be understood as knowing what the other person doesn't want. Everyone has a thumbscrew, an emotional experience that he or she finds extremely difficult to tolerate. Framing the achievement of your goal as either the means of preventing the application or a thumbscrew or of removing a thumbscrew that has already been applied can be tremendously effective. Indeed, this approach is typically more potent than the one previously described, as people are generally more motivated to avoid pain than to secure pleasure. If wanters can demonstrate that their goal is a means for their partners to avoid or escape pain, then they stand a much better chance of getting what they want. And this, of course, is facilitated by accurate knowledge of the other party's fears, insecurities, and vulnerabilities. Society typically frowns upon manipulating people's psychology like this. However, it happens every day in socially sanctioned ways. In reality, the most successful contingency management always includes utilizing knowledge in both its positive and its negative functions, the carrot and the stick. People pay taxes because their contributions help fund the infrastructure that makes their lives easier, and because not paying will land them in prison. People go to work because their labor serves others and generates income, and because not working will expose them to certain deprivations. People stay married because they want to honor their commitments and enjoy a loving partnership, and because divorce is a painful and expensive process. If societies can use contingency management to insensitize some behaviors and inhibit others, then individuals can do the same in their personal relationships. This management becomes more effective when individuals become more knowledgeable about what their partners want and don't want. Ultimately, people don't really have a choice but to exercise this principle, as those who can neither offer benefit nor threaten harm are functionally irrelevant. Relationships with such individuals are simply not possible, as there are no grounds for transaction. The only real choices people have are the degree to which they become knowledgeable about others and the extent to which they apply that knowledge in the service of their goals. Finally, the 10th principle is that the more powerful player is the one who is the better communicator. Words are magic. Simply calling something by its proper name affords some measure of control over it, and expressing an intention clearly and articulately is tantamount to casting an enchantment. If successful, words literally conjure ideas and emotions out of thin air. The magic word abracadabra is derived from Hebrew words that mean I create as I speak. A masterful command of language also enables more nuanced modeling, which allows our conceptualizations to more closely conform with reality, with all its diversity of experience. The right word is the key that opens many locks. However, semantic language is only one form of communication. As you'll recall, players are almost completely deprived of this method of expression in the theatrical game of Please No. This restriction forces them to rely more heavily on nonverbal forms of communication, especially tone and facial expression. When words have been stripped away, it becomes even more obvious that effective communication is coherent across as many different levels of expression as possible. What does this mean? Communication occurs across many different levels of expression simultaneously. Information is contained in semantic meaning, of course, but information is also contained in a glance, in a gesture, in a posture, in a movement, in a silence, in a tone. Indeed, in many cases, what isn't said is often more informative than what is. Communication becomes coherent to the extent that the same intention is simultaneously expressed on different levels of expression, and communication becomes incoherent to the extent that different intentions are simultaneously expressed on different levels of expression. For instance, players attempting to communicate intimidation would most effectively do so by glaring menacingly, standing erect, expanding their chests, crossing their arms, leaning forward, reducing personal distance, snarling or frowning their mouths, deepening their pitch, and flaring their nostrils. Words would not be necessary to communicate their intention. Everyone in the world would understand that they were trying to what they were trying to convey. In the game of mating and dating, the concept of communication coherence has two important applications. In the first place, it's generally not possible to get what you want if people don't understand what you want. I'll just put in there, unless they want the same thing. If you both happen to want the exact same thing, that's good. That's lucky. And it's generally not possible for people to understand what you want if your communication is incoherent. This is why effective communication is a form of power. It increases the likelihood of getting what you want from others for the simple reason that people are more likely to know what to give you. And in the second place, when communication is incoherent, especially between the levels of semantic language and emotional timbre, people will always give more weight to what is expressed non-verbally. Shrilly screaming, "I love and respect you," at the top of your voice with a crazed look on your face will probably not cause others to receive your message as intended. By the same token, purring, "You have some nerve coming here tonight," while gently stroking your partner with your fingertips will communicate something very different from what your words suggest. Of course, the most common manifestations of incoherence are not mixed messages like these, but rather verbal expressions, unaccompanied by emotional timbre. The absence of a nonverbal correlate generally my brain doesn't compute this sentence. Too dyslexic for this book. It's got some bloody words in this. This guy's a genius. The absence of a non-verbal correlate generally undermines the power of semantic language, especially when communicating information about internal states. So there you have it, 10 principles of power. In any given playthrough, the one who aligns more closely with these principles in both number and intensity is the powerful player and will win the game because they're the more powerful player. All things being equal, this means that players who move less are less committed, have more options, are more willing to sacrifice, are more willing to transgress, are more emotionally resilient, are less visible, are more flexible, are more knowledgeable, and are better communicators as much more likely to get what they want in relationships. Moving in the indicated direction of any of these dimensions leads to an increase in power. One page left. This is why sexual relationships, over time, tend to benefit women more than men. Since the average woman tends to align with more of these principles than the average man, she is typically the more powerful player in a heterosexual relationship. And since relative value tends to flow from the less powerful to the more powerful, we should expect women in sexual relationships to benefit as they do. Women are able to mate and date for gain because they are more adept at getting what they want from men than men are at getting what they want from women. On the other hand, men must generally mate and date for acceptable loss for the same reason. Ultimately, however, these realities have more to do with power than with biological sex. In this chapter, I argued that power, the ability to get other people to act in the service of your goals, is the single most decisive factor in the determination of the outcome of any game of Please No. of particular relevance, I noted that most of the attributes that people associate with this factor, like money, status, and physical strength, are proxies of power, while actual power is immaterial, as the lever that compels people to act is always psychological. I then discussed 10 principles of power, which collectively can be used to identify the more powerful player in any given interaction. These principles are applicable to relationships. These principles are applicable to relationships in general. However, another dimension of power exists that is especially relevant to sexual relationships in particular. We'll look at this important factor more closely in the next chapter. If you'd like to further explore the topics presented in this chapter, please click the link below in the description to access a curated playlist on Dr. Orion Taraban's Psych Hacks channel on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in to today's video. Next up, we will be on part 13, which will be the beginning of chapter 7. Also, if you are interested in really cool animal skulls and bones, check out the link in the description for my Etsy shop. This is Albert, the sheep skull. I sourced him from Wales. He still has a full set of teeth. His lower jaw / mandible is unavailable, but it's a pretty clean, pretty neat skull. If you want to buy this guy, let me know in the comments, and I'm sure I can sort something out. But as for now, this is just my little prop, and I have plenty on my shop. Don't forget, a cigar a day keeps the doctor away, and a coffee a day keeps the tiredness at bay. If you're liking the series, let me know what books I should read next. And a little disclaimer, like, just because I'm reading books doesn't mean I agree with everything they say. Some books can be quite controversial. But yeah, definitely feeling maybe reading some Stoicism next time. Thanks for tuning in. Peace out.